Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, joined, as always, by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, fantasy draft season is right around the corner. We've got our rankings ready to go for the good folks who log on to PFF.com, and of course, the ones who are kind enough to tune into the podcast as well. Last week, we covered 2025 running back rankings, and this week, we're diving into the wide receiver position. And well, I have yet to draft for 2025 just yet this offseason. You, sir, just recently completed your first 2025 draft. So tell us how that went for you.
Yes, I am actually midway through the draft, but had the Scott Fish Bowl started having their live drafts. The live one in Cincinnati was this past week, so finished the first several rounds of the draft, and now it's more of a slow draft, so hopefully won't be on the clock while we are recording this right now. But so far, so good. I was hoping that a couple players would fall to me here and there, and those players did not fall to me, so congratulations to the people in my league that have been sniping my picks, but have been getting players that I've been happy with throughout, and did a big rankings update Friday and Saturday. Now that I have written a bunch of the player profiles, about 200 of them to this point, started incorporating more ADP into it of like, do I want people to pick a quarterback at this point in the draft or avoid them and those kind of things. So all those minor tweaks of like moving quarterbacks and tight ends up and down just a little bit just to make sure people are getting the best value they can when they're doing their drafts.
Nice. I like it. Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, I really enjoy just being able to do a live draft whenever I can. It's always more satisfying to curse people out when they snipe you in person rather than, sending a message in the group chat or something like that. It's just more satisfying that way. To do it in person. But
Yeah.
it's always a good time as well, just to get to together with your league as well. Always makes it more fun. I know so many drafts are online these days, but kicking it old school and doing the live draft every once in a while is always a good time. But
Mhm.
like I said, we're going to get rocking here and talk wide receiver rankings, and like with the running back rankings episode, Nate, we're not necessarily going 1, 2, 3, etc., and discussing every player that and why we have them where we do, but instead kind of focusing on the wide receivers who were either higher or lower on than consensus based on the ADP, or higher and lower on than each other, and kind of talk about how we're projecting them for the 2025 season. So we'll start near the top here, Nate, because our wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 are the same. We both have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, respectively. Then things start to kind of shift for us a lot sooner than they did for the running back position, because you have BTJ, Brian Thomas Jr., as wide receiver 3. And we've gone in depth on BTJ in an earlier episode, so we don't need to dive too much into that today. But my wide receiver 3 is Puka Nacua. He's your wide receiver 4. He's going as wide receiver 4 on Underdog and wide receiver 5 on Sleeper. So Nate, we'll start with your take on Puka for 2025. And in your opinion, is he deserving of being in that kind of top tier with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson right now for fantasy?
I think so. I think first, Jamar Chase, I have him in a tier of his own just based on how far apart he was from everyone else last year and expect the offense to do a lot of the same. But I think Puka Nacua definitely deserves to be in that next tier of top wide receivers. Someone I think that should be considered in the middle of the first round rather than the later parts of the first round. I know if you look at ESPN, you look at Yahoo, you look at Sleeper, there he's going in the 8 to 10 range in all of those places. I have him a little higher than that, so I'd rather get him than some of the running backs. I'm guessing that's the same with you. We saw him finish third in fantasy points per game last season, and that includes a couple of the games earlier in the year where he went out with injury and then he was returning from injury. Wasn't playing 100% of snaps in those games. So if you exclude the games where he was playing less than 60% of snaps, he averaged 22.3 PPR points per game. That is usually good for second among wide receivers. We've seen him be the best wide receiver over the past 2 years in receptions per route and targets per route. Had an exceptional 37.1 target rate last season, which is the best we've seen out of a wide receiver in the 19 years we have data for among those with at least 75 routes. Similarly, the third best in yards per route run in a season, 3.56 last year. That's just behind Steve Smith in 2008 and Tyreek Hill in 2023. So he's been excellent. I think there's just the two big concerns with him, and I think anyone in that like 2 to 8 range where you can order them in basically any order you want, and you can argue your way into that. Um, there's the concern that they added Devontae Adams, which could cut into his target rate, which I think is a legitimate concern that Adams should receive more targets than Cooper Kupp was. Cooper Kupp still had a fairly large target rate as well, and this is still something where he's averaged 22.3 points per game last year when he was healthy. Even if that goes down by a point or two, that still puts him in this clear top 5 wide receiver range. And then the other concern for me is just Matthew Stafford, 37 years old, has already had a little bit of a dip in production, but we have seen him also rebound from a dip in production. He had his lowest grade in 2022, bounced back in a pretty significant way in 2023. So I would not be at all surprised if he is at the same place he was in 2024, in 2025. He could go up a little bit, he could go down a little bit. That does add a little bit of variability, but there we have seen Stafford play much better than he's played in 2024 before. And if that does happen, that could mean even greater things for Nacua.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Like I'm obviously definitely of the mindset that Puka should be in that top tier or near the top tier of fantasy wide receivers. Like he's obviously not been in the league as long as Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, but and he also doesn't come with the draft capital pedigree of Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson as well. But everything that he's done like since entering the league points to like a truly elite wide receiver. Like what we want for our fantasy wide receivers: targets, opportunity, right? And since 2023, since he entered the league, no player at any position who has run at least 250 routes over that span has a higher target rate than Puka Nacua. At 30% of his routes that he's getting targeted, it's an unreal number, and one that I don't know we should expect to change all that much, right? Like maybe not the 37% that it was last year, especially with Devontae Adams coming in, but Matthew Stafford and Sean McVay, they've been feeding Puka targets. But also just like his overall talent, when we consider targets are earned in this league as well, to have a higher target rate than both Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson over that span. And I think that's pretty impressive, and puts him in that conversation with those two. And sometimes I think people don't consider him in that kind of tier. And maybe if you're looking at even efficiency with the targets, if you're using yards per route run since 2023, like Puka owns the second best mark across all positions among those with at least 250 routes as well. 2.91 yards per route run is ahead of both Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. He owns a 91.8 receiving grade over that span as well, also ahead of both Chase and Jefferson. And I know it's on a slightly lower sample because he missed some time with injury as well, and that's definitely part of the concern. But it's a concern with a lot of players as well. But still, that's why he's also not ahead of Chase and Jefferson in my rankings. Like you said as well, Devontae Adams coming in there is a greater target competition than I think both Chase and Jefferson have. Like I love T. Higgins, but I don't think he's quite the target earner that Devontae Adams is, especially on a consistent route to route basis, right? But he's right there with him as far as I'm concerned. Like even though he hasn't hit the heights of being that past wide receiver one overall yet in his career, like those guys, I think he's as good a bet as anyone heading into this season to get there in 2025, which I'm kind of all in on him delivering on that potential this season. Very excited about 2025 Puka, and yeah, hoping that Matthew Stafford, can have a little bit better of a season than he did last year. But even still, as long as Stafford stays healthy for the year, I think that offense allows Puka Nacua to really thrive. And I think even with Devontae Adams there, he's survived with Cooper Kupp, and Devontae Adams, I think, is obviously a better player than Cooper Kupp, but I don't think it's that big of a detriment to what he could produce this season, that I would take him out of this kind of top range here. So yeah, I'm with you. I think the middle to early part of the first round is where I would definitely take him as well. I wouldn't let him fall to the end of the first round for sure. Okay, let's move a little further down the ranks to Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So he is wide receiver 17 on Underdog, wide receiver 16 on Sleeper. We're right about there with him, even though he's coming off a wide receiver 7 overall season. I think the obvious expectation for McLaurin is some regression, but not necessarily enough that he won't be a starting fantasy option for us in 2025. And a big reason for that is that Terry, he finally has the quarterback that we've so desperately waited for. After dealing with the worst version of Carson Wentz, the Taylor Heineke's, the Case Keenums, and Sam Howells of the world. Jaden Daniels, it comes in and proves that he is him, and that's the guy who we've been waiting for Terry to thrive, and he did deliver his best fantasy season ever in 2024 as a result. It's unfortunate that it took this long into his career for that to happen, because I'm sure, if Terry was 25 to 26 years old, we wouldn't necessarily expect as much regression, but it's hard not to bake in that, he's 30 years old now into this ranking at least a little bit, right? And the other negative part for McLaurin is that it's going to be difficult for him to replicate those touchdown totals again this season. Like, he finished with 13 touchdowns on the year, nearly double his previous season high for his career. And a lot of that came in the red zone, with 10 touchdowns on 14 red zone targets and 13 receptions, even though he was behind Zach Ertz in total red zone targets and target rate. So if that target share holds just between those two, then the numbers probably will regress some. But then you add in Deebo Samuel as well, who has had a tendency to get involved in that area of the field, either as a runner or a receiver. And now there's a little bit more competition there. All that being said, I think that's baked into his ADP already, and why he's kind of going outside the top 15 wide receivers on Underdog and Sleeper, and even in our rankings. But we're both at the point where I don't think he should fall too far from that top 15, because he's still a massive piece of this offense. Like, not only is he Jaden Daniels' projected top target each week, but I don't think the target competition around him is, you know, really even close to him losing that spot, maybe more than, a couple weeks across the entire season. And that might sound a bit contradictory, because I do think that Ertz and Deebo can contribute to his touchdown regression. I don't think they're great enough threats at this point in their careers to work as, the top consistent target earner on the team, outside of maybe a couple of times this season. You look at Deebo Samuel. He's coming off a career low in terms of PFF grades, both overall and a receiver. Yes, he's a year younger than Terry, but he's also dealt with a lot more injuries. So his body has this more, wear and tear, and probably less reliability than what we've gotten from McLaurin throughout his NFL career. And then Ertz, I mean, obviously, I don't think it would have been a surprise to anyone if he maybe even retired last offseason or this offseason, but he's back. He'll be turning 35 years old this season. And while he did have a nice sleeper season last year, he's still far removed from the Zach Ertz prime Philadelphia Eagle years, right? So I guess all that to say, I'm still a believer in McLaurin returning like strong fantasy potential this year. But what say you, Nate? What are your thoughts on him?
Oh, yeah, largely in agreement. I think the competition for targets, I think teams can have two fantasy relevant receivers and not have much problem. I think that's part of why, even though the Rams added Devontae Adams, those are the clear two targets in Los Angeles. And similarly in Washington, it's going to be McLaurin and Samuel. We know who Zach Ertz is at this point. He's going to have a pretty consistent, okay target rate. Austin Eckler at running back going to have a pretty consistent, okay target rate. Even the other wide receivers, we know who Noah Brown is at this point, and then they have some young mid-round wide receivers who could potentially play in the slot. So I think McLaurin's targets are going to be just fine. Not worried about the addition of Samuel at all there. I think it's just going to be changing targets from other players to Samuel, not McLaurin to Samuel, because these are two entirely different wide receivers. McLaurin has been incredibly consistent, hasn't missed a game the past 4 seasons, at least a top 31 fantasy wide receiver every year. So, in terms of consistency, he's been excellent. Like you said, there's that concern about touchdown regression. A lot of that is also kind of tied to some expected regression in terms of how well he's doing on contested targets. He caught 24 contested catches last season, which was the fourth most among any wide receiver over the past 6 years, which one of those seasons is another McLaurin season. So that's one reason for optimism. But caught them at a 70.6% rate, which is pretty unheard of in the years that we've been collecting that kind of data. And a lot of his touchdowns were on contested catches. So there is that concern for a regression in touchdowns, like you were saying. But I do think there's also the opportunity for McLaurin to make more big plays in the offense. If you look at Cliff Kingsbury's offenses over the years, he tends to have more deep passes. He tends to have like a lot of shorter stuff and then those deep passes to go along with it. And Jaden Daniels had a relatively low deep target rate last season. So I think there is room for more deep shots in this offense. And I think McLaurin is the clear player that would be targeted on those deep shots. So even if he doesn't score as many touchdowns, which is something that we expect and is why we don't have him as a top 10 option. I do think there is room for him to still have a better season than we've seen in the past in terms of some of his other production, in terms of yards and whatnot, since he's been very consistent between 900 and 1,200 yards. But if he's getting more of those deep shots, then he should be able to get more yards on without having a higher target rate.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, look, I would love to see another one of those, the Hail Mary touchdowns where, that I would sure we could count it as a contested target because it touched a bunch of hands there before it got tipped to McLaurin wide open in the end zone there at the end of the game, but against Chicago. But yeah, I would love to see more of that. Some of that stuff, obviously not going to be sustainable, but you're right. There is room, if they are going to start going deep a little bit more, it makes sense that McLaurin is their guy because that was somebody that found success in that role last season, obviously with Jaden Daniels. So I like it. Still feeling optimistic about McLaurin. Okay, how about on to a player, Nate, that you're higher on than ADP? It turns out that I'm lower on Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. So he's been rising in ADP recently, going as wide receiver 24 on Underdog, still just around wide receiver 29 on Sleeper. Nate, you have him as wide receiver 22, so a low end wide receiver 2 for you. I have him as a low end wide receiver 3. So tell us why we should be excited about JMO in 2025.
Sure. Very optimistic about what he can do this year. He was a top 15 NFL draft pick despite coming into the NFL with a torn ACL, knowing that he would miss most of his rookie season. We saw him barely play as a rookie. We saw him in 2023 play kind of a part time role, was only playing around 53% of offensive snaps, so still somewhat coming back from that injury. And even last year, we saw a big jump in terms of his snap rate, was playing around 80% of snaps. We saw a big jump in his receiving grade, was at 75.1 over the season. But over the second half of the season, despite all of the weapons that Detroit has in the offense, he was becoming a consistent fantasy weapon in the offense. He was scoring at least 8 PPR points every week from week 10 until the end of the season, averaged 15.3 points per game, which ranked 22nd over those 9 weeks of the season, which is right where I have him for this year. He's been the best at yards after the catch last year, ranked first in that. And it really takes a quarterback who's highly accurate to get a wide receiver in a good position to get those yards after the catch. So Jared Goff being a highly accurate quarterback has been a huge help for Williams. I don't think we talk enough about what happens when a starting quarterback gets injured. And probably my biggest concern for Williams is if there is a Jared Goff injury, that would be pretty detrimental to Williams' fantasy value. But it sounds like new offensive coordinator John Morton has loved him so far, said he's had an unbelievable offseason, and quote, "I'm so excited to see him this year because it's going to be a breakout year." So I think they really like Williams. Even at his introductory press conference, was talking about how much he wanted explosive plays out of this Detroit offense. So Williams is someone I'm high on. Gibbs is also someone I'm high on for his explosiveness. And because of that, not as high on Montgomery or St. Brown or Laporta compared to ADP for those players. So I think we'll see Williams be a big part of this offense, and seeing how good he was in college, if he starts living up to that potential, that is a top 10 potential wide receiver, with the only thing holding him back is how many other good players there are in this offense. But the new offensive coordinator said a lot more good things about Williams than he has the other players in this offense so far. So optimistic that he can take a step forward from where he was to end last season when he was averaging those 15 points per game, which was right around wide receiver 22.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because like I mean, I agree. Like he definitely has that potential. I liked him, as a prospect coming out. I guess like for me, where I'm kind of ranking him, I guess looking at him this season, like I like him less like right now as a weekly kind of starting option in those like non-best ball formats, because even with like that more involved season last year, and I thought it was a breakout season for him last year. Like he was still a little bit more boom bust than I would have liked on a weekly basis. Like he had these great weeks where he could have definitely helped you win the week. But I think the offense in and of itself being more run heavy and having so many mouths to feed in the passing game kind of created this potential for these bust weeks as well, where he just maybe isn't or doesn't have to be a big enough part of the game plan, which I thought could hurt like his wide receiver 2 potential compared to maybe some of the more consistent options in this range, like guys like who I really like Ted McMillan. I like his potential coming out the gate here as a rookie. Devontae Smith, who's also in a highly crowded offense, but I think there's more consistency and kind of historic high end play to bank on there. And DJ Moore, I think he's in a similar situation in Chicago where it's crowded, but I think he at least has a better chance of leading the Bears in receiving production this season than where I don't think that's necessarily the case with JMO. And that's kind of what a lot of the players that moved ahead of him for me in the rankings as well. Like I thought had those that better chance of leading their team in receiving production, like DK Metcalf. I think it's an easy bet to lead the Steelers in passing production and plays like on a similarly, kind of run heavy team as the Lions as well. Cortland Sutton in Denver, those types. So I don't know that this is even as much as not liking JMO as much as it is like kind of preferring some of the better and potentially more consistent bets ahead of him. But I'm sure I could probably afford to move him up some in these rankings as we get closer to week one, right? I just have a hard time keeping him out of that kind of wide receiver 3 territory for redraft is all. But I mean, at the same time, like I like that high end potential. So yeah, not impossible. I could definitely see it here for Jameson Williams in 2025.
I could see the Lions being a little more pass heavy this year with the
Yeah.
new offensive coordinator and the retirement of Frank Ragnow, who was an excellent run blocking
Mhm.
center for the team. So I could see them moving a little bit away from the run game, even though I expect the Lions to be winning a lot of games and therefore running a lot in the fourth quarter. But in terms of like pass and run rate over expected, I could see that changing a little bit more in passing favor.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, another player who I did come in a little bit higher on JMO, higher on than JMO, right now, and higher than consensus, especially on Underdog, where he's going as wide receiver 37 at the moment, Nate, and we're both higher on him than that. You have him as wide receiver 27, I have him as wide receiver 30, and again, another case of kind of being just the clear and obvious leader for this team in receiving production for 2025. It's Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So assuming he's healthy, right? Because that was obviously a major concern last year, where he suffered multiple concussions that knocked him out for basically the second half of last season. I know there was the chance that they could have brought him back, but I think based on how the team was doing, it just wasn't a possibility for them. They just decided to keep him shut down. And he clearly wasn't himself last year. He had just the 100-yard game across like his 8 appearances. And while he was like a locked in wide receiver 2 through his first 2 years in the league as well, he only returned that value, I think, 3 times in his 8 games, usually finishing much lower than top 24 at his position on a weekly basis. And as much as part of me is still concerned about the concussion stuff, because it is obviously a serious thing and it's repeatable, I think a year removed and an apparently healthy offseason, I think wide receiver 37 is really low and probably the floor for what we should expect from Olave this season. Like I think there was even a chance that, like I said, he'd come back earlier last season if the Saints season wasn't completely lost, but who knows. But either way, if we're assuming like he can bounce back and stay healthy, there's not really much question that anyone else will lead this team in receiving production. Even as much as I don't think the Saints offense will be good, we'll still take the top target on any offense for fantasy, especially one going outside the top 36 players at its position, and one young enough with like enough track record or strong enough track record of high end receiving potential as well. He delivered over 1,000 yards in his first 2 years, low 80s receiving grade all 3 years, over 2 yards per route run in each season as well. So really still like Olave, hopeful that he's healthy this year. And Nate, you're even slightly higher than I am. So what else should we know about the Saints wide receiver 1 for 2025?
Yeah, like you said, we think he's going to be the clear top target in this team, and he should be one of the top targets in the league. He has a 25% career target rate, which is eighth best among wide receivers over the past 3 years. And like you said, the 2.2 yards per route run, which is where he's at in his career, ninth best among wide receivers. So he's been very consistent when he's on the field. I think at least some people are probably looking at his per game stats last year, and that's not entirely fair because he's left games early with concussions, and then those first 2 weeks, the Saints were blowing out teams, so he wasn't needed much in the second half of those games. But if you just look at the games that were just like normal games where he was actually playing in the fourth quarter, averaged 14.7 PPR points per game, so he was relatively fine in those games. I do think the concussion thing is a pretty serious concern, even though like he should be 100% able to play week 1 and play at his usual level of abilities. the more concussions you have, the easier it is to get concussions and the longer you're out once you have a concussion. So even though you should be able to put him in your fantasy lineup week one, there is always that chance that he suffers a concussion, which is a higher rate than any other, or not any other player, but other players that don't have the same concussion history. And then the likelihood that he could miss like half the season or the entire season with another concussion. So there is that high level of risk baked in. But I think part of this is the wide receiver field is so talented that you're okay taking risk at wide receiver in this range because you're able to draft more wide receivers later who you can safely put in your starting lineup even if they don't have the same upside. So I'm okay taking those kind of risks. I think there's also the just general quarterback situation in New Orleans. There's a chance that this is going to be his least productive season because of the quarterback situation. But I do think some of that can be counteracted with Kellen Moore as the new head coach for the team. He has generally helped the offenses that he's been a part of, and we have seen these slot receivers in those offenses play very well. They've averaged between 15 and 21 PPR points per game, so that's typically anywhere from a top five wide receiver to a top 20 wide receiver. So I think those range of outcomes are definitely possible for Olave because I think he is the best suited player among their top wide receivers to be playing in the slot. If we found out that like Brandon Cooks was going to be their full time slot receiver, or something like that, I would probably move Olave down a little bit because I expect him to play the slot, and I expect that to be a positive in his favor. But his ranking could change if we get more news on it. I've tried to find news of what the Saints are thinking with their slot position, but I also don't think last year we were really getting all that much saying Devontae Smith is definitely going to be the slot receiver for Philadelphia. And then we saw it play out in the season where Smith was playing more in the slot than he had been at any point in his career. So hopefully it works out for Olave that he was playing that role.
Yeah, I hope so. Like you said, like I think the risk at this point in the draft is minimal for taking Olave. Like, yeah, there's risk of re-injury and him with the concussions and missing time again. But I think like at wide receiver 37, like that's a risk that I'm perfectly fine in investing in. Obviously, we have him ranked higher than that for that reason because he has that potential to be a high end weekly starter for us. So yeah, if he's healthy, like that makes him one of the better values in this entire draft, even all things considered, based on the Saints offense and the quarterback situation and the concussion risk, all that stuff. It's already baked in well enough that we're drafting him at basically what his floor could be. So, or lower than his floor potentially. So, yeah, I'm very happy with the ADP cost at Chris Olave right now. I feel like it'll probably come up as we get closer to the season, as he's looking healthy and all the injury stuff kind of goes away as week one gets closer. But yeah, still right now, I really love the value here. Okay, before we go on to the rest of the wide receivers, I do want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Fabric by Gerber Life. Now is still a great time to reevaluate financial goals, not just for yourself, but for your kids. Now is the perfect time to make sure your kids are on a path toward a solid financial future. A kid's investment account from Fabric by Gerber Life is quick and simple to set up and lets you invest in their future now for education, big milestones, and more. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Kids can't invest when they're minors, but a kid's investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now, giving their investments more time to grow. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Then you can manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. Funds can be used for nearly anything, benefiting your child from tuition and tutors to music classes. And when they're adults and out on their own, they can use the funds for anything they need. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, MEET fabric.com/fantasy. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Okay, keeping it rolling here. We talked about one Commanders wide receiver already. Let's talk about the other, Nate. That's Deebo Samuel, making it his first year with the Washington Commanders. Deebo is going as wide receiver 39 on Underdog, wide receiver 41 on Sleeper. Nate, you're more optimistic about Deebo this season. You have him as wide receiver 33. So what do you think? What do you like about Deebo heading into 2025?
This is another case where I think this is a very high upside wide receiver with a lot of risk involved with it. But like I said, there are plenty of wide receivers lower that are safer wide receivers, like even on this list, Jacoby Myers a very safe wide receiver 3 option, Jerry Judy, another similarly safe wide receiver 3 option. So other guys you can get lower to pair up with these risky wide receivers. But Samuel, at his ceiling, he was wide receiver 3 in 2021, and then has just dealt with a ton of injuries over the last season. Had 6 different injuries he was listed with on the official injury report. So that has been a problem for him recently, but I'm really excited about how he can be used in Washington. He has been the clear avoided tackle machine for wide receivers over the course of his career, on the clear top wide receiver in basically any metric you look at, whether it's total number of missed tackles per route, missed tackles per reception. Even last year, with all of his injuries, his point 0 or 0.314 avoided tackles per reception was the most among wide receivers. So even though a lot of things didn't go right for Samuel last year, he was still avoiding tackles. The exciting part about Washington's offense is Cliff Kingsbury is the offensive coordinator for Washington, and seeing what he was doing in Arizona with guys like Rondale Moore and Greg Dortch over the past 6 seasons. Both Moore and Dortch are among the bottom 8 wide receivers in average depth of target, and Deebo Samuel is also in that range. We've also had Samuel and Moore as the 2 of the 4 wide receivers with at least 4 receptions when lined up out of the backfield over these past couple of seasons. So I think we're going to see a lot of those similar things of how they were trying to use Rondale Moore, how they were trying to use Dortch, to a bit of mixed success in Arizona. But Samuel's a bit of a better player, better at avoiding tackles. I'm really excited about how he's going to be used there. And like we were talking about earlier with Washington, there's not that much other competition for targets. There's a lot of respectable players in the offense, but basically all of these guys are veterans where we know who they are and what their target share is going to look like. And Samuel is definitely capable of having a target rate of around 20%, which is good enough to be a fantasy starter, along with I expect him to be running the ball at least some throughout the season. So we know Austin Eckler, Zach Ertz, Noah Brown, all veterans who will have decent, okay target rates, but nothing that should be cutting into either Deebo Samuel or Terry McLaurin. And like we were saying, McLaurin, very different wide receiver, higher average depth of target, higher deep target rate. Samuel, very low average depth of target. So these two are not competing for the same targets. They'll both be on the field plenty. Not concerned about two of them coexisting whatsoever in this offense.
Yeah, it's a good call. Like I think I could definitely afford to get more optimistic about Debo this year. Like especially like if we could guarantee that he'd be healthy for the year. I do worry obviously about, the injury history. Like he's one of the worst bets for for him to stay healthy in 2025, especially like as he gets older now, right? Like there were a ton of injuries that he dealt with last season, as the ribs and the calf were the more serious ones. He had the shoulder and hamstring and ankle and knee before, and it's why he's only played like a full season once in his 6-year career. So that's the part that I think the concern mostly comes from for me, is I feel like I can't trust him enough. But that being said, like I don't hate the idea of him as this kind of wide receiver 3 or flex option this season, since the cost is even lower than that, right? So I can get behind betting on him a little earlier than wide receiver 40 or wherever he's going, since expectations are low, right? And there's at least upside, like you highlighted, that I'm more willing to bet on, depending especially on how the rest of my draft looks. Like if I have leaned on maybe some safer options earlier in the draft, then Deebo is more likely, I think, to come into play for me here in these kind of middle to late rounds, because of the upside. Like, we talked about it with Terry McLaurin as well, but I do really like his potential in the high scoring areas of the field. He ranks first among all wide receivers since 2021 in overall red zone touches, which is carries and receptions. And a big part of that is taking those crucial carries. He has 42 carries in the red zone since 2021, which is 30 more than the next closest player. Like, I don't think it's implausible that Deebo will be a top option for the Commanders in that area of field this season. Again, as long as he's healthy, which will bring some really important touchdown upside to boost his value. So probably like that, at least more than some in this range, maybe more than, the Khalil Shakirs and Jacoby Meyer types in this range. So yeah, I'm with you. I think I could afford to move Deebo up a little bit, just betting on the potential upside compared to some of the other guys in this range. So again, it's just really, it's the health thing that scares me. He's dealt with so much that it's scary.
Yeah, I'll just add both with Samuel and Terry. Like Washington's offense was a top five scoring offense
Yeah.
last season. We expect them to be one of the highest scoring offenses again this year. And a very general rule of thumb people have for fantasy is draft players on the good offenses. And in Washington, there's not really anyone else outside of at quarterback that we're drafting all that high. We're not prioritizing the running backs in this backfield. Zach Ertz probably not going to be someone getting drafted in redraft leagues. No other wide receivers outside of Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel are going to get drafted in redraft leagues this year. So like someone's going to have to be getting them down the field. Someone's going to have to be scoring points for them. It's going to be Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel doing a lot of that work. So again, as long as Samuel stays healthy. Jacoby Myers, I think, is a great comparison. Someone who's on the screen right now of like, we know Myers is going to be that safe wide receiver three option. He should leave that wide receiver room and targets. You can put him in your fantasy starting lineup. He's probably not going to be a top 15 wide receiver. So if you need that kind of safe player, Myers is right there, where Samuel is either going to be a top 24 option or he's going to be injured and you probably don't want him on your roster anymore. And hopefully you'll know that sooner rather than later which one he is. But I find taking those kind of risks because there's even wide receivers further down this list that I'm like, I can trust you in my lineup if I need a wide receiver in my lineup.
Yeah, for sure. It's balancing that kind of risk reward, right? And I think at this point in the drafts, yeah, there's some safe options for a while that we can still draft, and I think betting on the upside of Deebo makes sense as well for sure. But let's talk about some of the wide receivers that Deebo left behind in San Francisco here for a second, because we got both Jawan Jennings and Brandon Ayuk to look at. And while we're both at wide receiver 41 for Ayuk, I'm at least much higher on Jawan Jennings, who I have as the 49ers wide receiver one right now for this season. And I think it would be closer, like if Ayuk was healthy. But he's coming off obviously the torn ACL, which is concerning for just how effective he'll be in that first year back. He's also like apparently unhappy about the contract that he signed last offseason. So while it felt like that issue was maybe behind us, he's decided to bring it up again, right? Coming off as kind of disgruntled with the team. So there are like these red flags around Brandon Ayuk right now that honestly make it feel like he's either not going to have a great season if he stays with the team, but then also, starts up these trade rumors as well. So it just feels like one of the weirdest players heading into the year for me. Meanwhile, Jawan Jennings, he's basically like John Lovitz in The Wedding Singer, as Brandon Ayuk is, for the purposes of this analogy, losing his mind, and Jennings is reaping all the benefits here because he did it last year. He stepped up in a big way with Ayuk and Christian McCaffrey out. He delivered 3 top 10 finishes on the year. He finished the year as the PPR wide receiver 25. He ranked top 15 at the position in target rate and yards per route run. Like, if Ayuk takes, half the season to get fully healthy, if he even continues to play for the 49ers as well, like I really love the potential of Jawan Jennings in this offense, because I do expect the 49ers offense as a whole to kind of bounce back. I think we've touched on that a little bit before. I think we've even talking about Christian McCaffrey, right? Where I think Brock Purdy, Christian McCaffrey, those guys can definitely have better years. Christian McCaffrey for sure. And I just think that there's room for Jawan Jennings to be one of the prime beneficiaries of that in this offense, especially if it takes Brandon Ayuk, half the season to get fully healthy, or maybe, who knows what's going to happen there. But Nate, what's your take on this 49ers wide receiver core? Because it feels like there's a lot of ways that this thing can go in 2025.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest takeaway that we're both in agreement on is I think the 49ers offense will be a lot better this season. It should look a lot more like the 49ers offense of other recent years than last year. Last year, there was just so much that went wrong with injuries on both sides of the ball, things that were happening off the field that were outside of the players' control. That was just a lot for the team, and especially like having done so well in so many seasons and not winning a Super Bowl any of those years, even though they had the talent to, they ideally would have won a Super Bowl one of those years because they had talented enough teams to win a Super Bowl. But expect things to be better this season. We are higher on both Jennings and IU compared to consensus. Consensus ADP at ESPN, Sleeper, Yahoo, putting those together. Jennings is wide receiver 41, Ayuk's wide receiver 46. So both of them were at least a couple spots higher than ADP. I'll be curious to see how these wide receivers get deployed this year once everyone is healthy. Jennings is someone who kind of played all over the place. He was historically a slot receiver, played the Z receiver role that 1 week Samuel was out early in the season, took over Ayuk's role later in the season. He's played better in terms of yards per route run out of the slot. Ricky Pearsall, their rookie last year, second year receiver this year, was playing in the slot, has played better out wide in terms of yards per route run. So I'll be curious to see if that switches around and Jennings gets to play more in the slot again, as long as he's also playing in those two wide receiver sets. I'm concerned with a healthy Christian McCaffrey that this is going to be one of the more crowded teams in terms of targets. George Kittle, one of the best tight ends in the league, if not the best tight end. So he's going to have a lot of targets like usual. And McCaffrey will see a decent number of targets. And like Brandon Ayuk, yeah, there's the injury, there's the red flags that you were talked about. He still had a 92 receiving grade in
Mhm.
2023. So at Ayuk's best, Ayuk is still one of the best wide receivers in the league. So even though there's plenty of risk to him, I think why we're both ahead on him in term rather than consensus is because we know he has that high end upside of being a top 10 real life wide receiver, which probably doesn't translate to a top 10 fantasy wide receiver because of all the good players in San Francisco's offense. But I think the upside's there for him, but I think it's also there for Jennings. I'll be curious to see how it works out. Ricky Pearsall, I'm kind of right at ADP with him. There's a chance he has a breakout year. We saw a couple flashes here and there. So part of it is I don't know which 49ers wide receiver will end up emerging as the clear top target on the team, but I'm happy to take chances on them because I think whoever does become the top target should have a top 20, top 25 fantasy season, which is a lot better than where you're currently drafting them.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Like, it definitely feels like the range of outcomes for this 49ers wide receiver core is all over the place. And look, as much as there are the kind of red flags around Brandon Ayuk, like you said, we're both higher on him than consensus because we're working on the information that he is going to be back for the 49ers this year. He is going to be ready for week 1. And if that happens, even if it takes him a little longer to get up to, full health and to speed, like, he could still be the very much the top option in this passing game. So he holds that potential there, right? And yeah, it's part of the reason why I came in like slightly lower on ADP than consensus on like Ricky Pearsall as well, is just because, like you mentioned, there are a lot of mouths to feed in this 49ers offense. And I think if all these guys are there for week 1 and stay healthy, like, it doesn't leave a lot of meat on the bone for Pearsall, but I mean, definitely has, a good shot as well of emerging, especially as a former first round pick. I wasn't crazy about like his college profile, so that's another part of the reason why I came in a little bit lower on him. But I do believe in like Jawan Jennings and at least Brandon Ayuk as well. So we'll see how it shakes out. It'll be one of the more interesting teams to watch this year. I think San Francisco, as they look to bounce back here in 2025. But let's talk about a couple more wide receivers, Nate, and we'll focus next on our or on the wide receiver 32 on Underdog, wide receiver 37 on Sleeper. And Nate, the past couple of years, I've been lower than consensus on Calvin Ridley. This year, it seems I'm slightly higher somehow, and it's you that's on the Calvin Ridley train, ranking him as your wide receiver 42. So, what do you think about his outlook here in 2025?
I think he's someone who is capable of still being a wide receiver 3, but I don't think he has the upside that a bunch of other wide receivers in this range have. So for me, even though I probably project him to score a little bit more points than wide receiver 42, it's the opportunity for upside. Really, we've seen him kind of be pretty much the same wide receiver the past 2 seasons, even though it was with two different teams. A lot of his stats were fairly similar from one team to the other. He's the clear top wide receiver in Tennessee. He had that rough stretch early in the season, but by week 8, he did start to find a little bit more consistency, averaging 14 fantasy points per game from week 8 on, which was 30th best among wide receivers. So he was in that wide receiver 3 category last year. The big difference this year is they added Cam Ward at quarterback, so that's probably the biggest reason for optimism. But Ward wasn't always the most accurate quarterback, especially on those intermediate and deeper passes, and that's where Ridley gets all of his targets is on those intermediate and deeper passes. So I'm not sure the quality of passes going Ridley's way are going to be that much more improved compared to what we've seen. I think it could be other parts of the offense that start improving more with Ward at quarterback. So I'm not sure that's going to be the greatest fit in the world. So even though he should still see a decent number of targets, I just don't see that clear path to him being a top 25 wide receiver without Cameron Ward being an excellent rookie, which I have a hard time seeing, especially with the offensive line and other talent in Tennessee. I don't expect this to be one of the better offenses in the league. So when you have other wide receivers in this range, like Josh Downs is another player I view as like he's going to be probably a wide receiver three, probably not much more than a wide receiver three, but you can get him a couple rounds later than Ridley. Or there's other players like Rome Odunze has a very similar ADP everywhere than Calvin Ridley. Much more risky wide receiver. There's a chance he's the fourth receiving option in the offense, but also a chance that he ends up being the best receiving option in the offense in what could be a much better offense. So I think Adunze has a much higher upside, even though he has much more risk. But when I'm drafting a wide receiver in this range, if I'm going to get someone that I think is only capable of being a wide receiver three, I'm going to draft them a little bit later. Khalil Shakir, another player that is on the screen right now that I feel is in that kind of situation where don't see him having this huge season, but I can put him in my fantasy starting lineup. And that's similar to how I view Ridley.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Yeah, the main thing really for me was that, he is the top target in Tennessee. I don't think it's likely to be particularly close considering the other options on the team, Tyler Lockett, Van Jefferson, you got the rookies there. Overall, like there should be a really nice volume of targets kind of thrown in his direction. He cleared 100 targets pretty easily last season. Will probably do so again, right? And I think, the helping his case at least a little bit this year is Cam Ward coming in as probably the best quarterback he's had here in Tennessee, because even though he's only been here with the team for a year, he had two starting quarterbacks throwing to him last year, Will Levis and Mason Rudolph, both of whom were not very good. The other part of it is that I think Ridley's average depth of target last season, it was a career high at 16.0, which was a top 10 mark at the position, and it created a lot, like a career low in terms of reception rate as well, at just 56.6% because of those lower percentage throws and poor accuracy as well. Now, Cam Ward, he was not incredible as a deep passer, but part of the reason there were so many deep throws last year as well was the Will Levis factor of him just chucking it up deep. Like he was better at not doing that as much as he did in his rookie season, but he still was throwing deep, like at a pretty high rate. He had a top 10 average depth of target in the league. While then Mason Rudolph came in, that average depth of target was below average. So it wasn't so much, a Brian Callahan thing as much as it was Will Levis can't help himself type thing. But if Ward can be more accurate on those deep throws than, were Rudolph and Levis, that's a plus. It's not that hard to achieve. And on the chance that Ridley's usage is closer to your average wide receiver when it comes to crossing routes and the ins and outs and the sort, because he definitely was running those routes at a slightly lower rate than average there, in which case he could have a chance to outperform this ranking, but that feels less likely, which is why I'm closer to him just being a wide receiver three for fantasy this year, basically. So yeah, I came in a little bit higher on him, but he's not necessarily somebody that I'm excited about. Like you said, he doesn't necessarily hold that high end upside, if you're shooting for that, but a safe volume heavy target, I think is, basically what we're looking at here for Calvin Ridley.
Yeah, he's safe, but like he's also 30 years old at this point, so I don't
Yeah.
expect him to get better than what he's been. He has 1 year where he's had a receiving grade above 75, been very consistent in that 70 to 75 range in terms of receiving grade. So, like, I agree he's going to see plenty of targets. You do make a good point about the quarterback differences we saw last year and that potentially changing his usage and lower average depth of target this season, which should help him be a safer wide receiver three. But like we were saying, like with the 49ers wide receivers who have more upside, I'm more likely to take a chance on one of them because of that upside.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. All right, Nate, let's do one more here. Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. He finished as the PPR wide receiver 28 overall in back-to-back seasons. He's going as the wide receiver 43 on Underdog and wide receiver 44 on Sleeper. I am as wide receiver 43. You hate Jaden Reed and have him as wide receiver 55. No, I kid. I'm sure you don't actually hate Jaden Reed, right? No, don't answer that. Let's leave the listeners hanging there for a little bit longer. Instead, I'll give the optimistic outlook on Reed, if we can even call it that, since I have him as wide receiver 43. I don't think I'm that optimistic, but I do think like he's probably the Packers' best option at the position right now, even if it's only a slight edge in his favor, because even though he wasn't nearly as good in the second half of last season as he was to start the year, he's still relatively efficient with his opportunities. Like, he ranked top 20 at the position in yards per route run and in fantasy points per snap with at least 50 targets last season. And there were more opportunities for him than just as a receiver as well, because he took 20 carries, which was tied for the second most at the position, behind only Deebo Samuel. But he was also way more effective in that role than even a Deebo Samuel. He led all wide receivers in rushing yards with 163 at 8.2 yards per carry. So more rushing yards than Deebo Samuel on less than half the carries. Have to figure that the Packers will continue to kind of get him involved out of the backfield, because he's now had over 100 rushing yards in each of his first two seasons as well, and super efficient with those opportunities. I know that Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks and Tucker Kraft are still there. They spent a first round pick on Matthew Golden, who, we've talked about before, I'm not a big believer in him hitting the ground running as a rookie, but it's not impossible. But all those bodies is why he's like only wide receiver 43 for me, despite, the potential of being the team's top wide receiver. I think based on everyone they have there, the team leading production isn't necessarily going to be great, but I still think he'll have some value as one of kind of the better depth options at the position, considering kind of everything else. But Nate, that's really about as glass half full outlook as I could provide for like a later round wide receiver. Now I'll give you the chance to respond to the allegations that you hate Jaden Reed.
Sure. So it's more his role in the Packers offense that's been the problem, and I think will be an even worse problem this year than it was last year. He's been someone who plays in the three wide receiver sets only plays in the slot in those sets, doesn't play in two wide receiver sets. That has been true from the first preseason game he played to the end of last season. Expect that to be true this year. He showed those sparks at the end of 2023, was averaging 20 fantasy points per game. But that came at a time where both the top two running backs, other three wide receivers, top two tight ends all missed time during that stretch late in 2023. So I think injuries had a lot to do with his volume. He was someone where when the Packers were losing games, that's the only time where Reed had a chance to shine. He had three 100-yard games last year. Those happened in three of their six losses. In every other game outside of those three games, so the other 14 games during the season, he averaged 2.9 receptions and 33 receiving yards per game. So there were really those only couple of weeks where you'd be comfortable starting him, and you probably didn't know ahead of time which weeks you could be comfortable starting him or not. So that makes it very hard to know if you can ever put him in your fantasy starting lineup. And things are probably going to get worse this season after the Packers spent two of their early round draft picks on wide receivers. One of the things that has made Reed so good in terms of yards per route run, fantasy points per route, is he's one of those rare slot receivers that gets used a lot on these deeper plays that lead to really big plays. He's caught a pass for at least 30 yards on 2.7% of his routes over the past two seasons, which is the best among wide receivers. Averages 0.64 receptions at 30 or more yards per game, which is second best. A touchdown on 1.8% of his routes, which is top five for wide receivers. So a lot of his production has been on these big plays rather than consistent production, which is in line with the fact that he only plays those certain snaps. But a lot of that has to do with the Packers at times not having another deep threat at wide receiver. When Christian Watson's been healthy, Reed's only averaged 47 yards per game. That jumps up to 57 yards per game. When Watson has been out, which has been a significant amount, we expect Watson to be out a lot this season, maybe not until later in the season, but they drafted Matthew Golden, who I expect to have that role as their outside deep threat at wide receiver. So I think Reed will see fewer deep targets because they'll have Matthew Golden. And then once Watson is back, that'll complicate things even further. And then you talked about some of his usage out of the backfield, running the ball as well. Jameson Williams is someone they drafted who's going to also be able to do some of that. The coaches were talking about like over the stretch, Reed was starting to get more banged up, which is concerning considering how little he was used at times last year, and how having more players that should allow him to still be effective when they do use him. But I think because they have so many players in this offense at running back, at tight end, at wide receiver, the ball is just going to get spread out a ton that you'll never know when to start Reed. So while I'd be more comfortable having him in best ball because there will probably be those 2 or 3 weeks this season where he gets 100 yards, we just never know when it's going to happen. So he's not someone that can help you in redraft, even though he can have those big weeks that can help you in your best ball leagues.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like, I could definitely see this Packers receiving core as just being a gross unit to trust like all year long, right? Like, I feel like we're not going to feel great about putting any of these guys in our lineup, like unless somebody like a Matthew Golden like really emerges as like this clear kind of wide receiver one. Like, I could definitely see it just being a very muddied situation throughout the year where we don't know who's going to be the top receiving option on a weekly basis, and then that does make them less valuable for fantasy because we're not going to want to start them, right? So yeah, I'm with you. I think there's again another wide range of outcomes here for somebody like a Jaden Reed, but I mean, this Packers offense, as good as it should be for NFL wise, less ideal for fantasy for sure.
And I'd say,
Uh,
like with Reed, it's a wide range of outcomes from one week to another, but I'm not sure what would happen outside of them trusting him on every down, which goes against what they've been saying. So, like,
mhm.
I don't see that range of outcomes for an entire season of him being someone that you can consistently start. Where other guys on the screen now, Jaden Higgins has a wide range of outcomes. He could become this clear, or Christian Kirk right ahead of him as well. Either one could become the clear number two wide receiver for Houston, and you can trust them in your lineup each week, or they become the third option or the fourth option in the offense. Where Reed is just going to run 20 routes per game, have a couple of big plays at times. I don't see him having a chance to get to a point where he's running 30 routes per game.
Yeah, no, that's fair for sure. Yeah, and yeah, appreciate the Jaden Higgins shout out. Hopefully, he does get that consistent wide receiver two role. I am a fan. But that is going to wrap us up for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and if you're watching on the YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Nate, thanks to you as well. And before we go, I think this was your last week for now of writing player profiles on the site. Is that right? Yeah, you said 200,
Yes.
over 200.
Oh yeah, right around 200, and there's even a couple of players where I'm like, oh, I should have wrote a player profile about them. So once I find some free time, I'll sneak a couple more in. But next week is when I start having a lot more diverse content in terms of what I'm writing. I've been starting the drafts on a bunch of the perfect draft strategy articles, which have been a lot of fun, and I think a lot of interesting draft strategies that can work this season depending on where you're picking. So next week will be the start of the perfect draft strategy articles. We'll also have more ranking articles next week now that I've done a deep dive and changed a bunch of rankings. We'll start having a lot of other kind of content like sleepers and breakouts and those kind of list of players that you want to consider or not consider at various points in the draft. So those articles will also be coming out starting next week.
Nice. Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. And then, yeah, as for me, all of my rankings and tiers will be up on the site by the end of this week with quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. They're all up there now. The IDP tiers are hitting over the next 2 days here. Linebacker, defensive line are already up, and then defensive back is coming up tomorrow. And then an offense plus IDP rankings piece will be up on Friday. So please do check those out as well. Nate is off next week, so we'll skip one episode until he's back, but I'll have like some IDP episodes in there and stuff like that to fill the gap. So hopefully I'll see you there. And until then, peace out.